I am Dr. Márcio Pereira, a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist, and I dedicate my work to studying how the human brain constructs emotions, bonds, and behavioral patterns that we rarely consciously perceive. Today, I want to talk about something that seems simple at first glance, but which hides one of the deepest conflicts of the human mind: the neurological truth about a lack of friends. When someone admits to having few or no friends, the socially accepted explanation usually emerges almost automatically, as if it were ready-made, just waiting for the right occasion to be used. We say it's shyness, lack of time, overwork, emotional maturity, or even a supposed healthy selectivity, as if solitude were a conscious, rational, and well-resolved choice. In many cases, the individual adopts this narrative, not because it's true, but because it's bearable. It organizes discomfort into socially acceptable words and prevents more dangerous questions from being asked. The problem is that this explanation only works on the surface of behavior, never at the level where the brain actually operates. The human brain was not designed to evaluate relationships like a resume, nor to replace effective connections with productivity, hobbies, or solitary entertainment. From a neurological point of view, the prolonged absence of social ties is neither neutral nor optional. It activates ancient systems deeply linked to survival, threat, and the fear of abandonment, even if the individual does not consciously associate their loneliness with immediate suffering. Contrary to popular belief, the brain doesn't interpret a lack of friends as a detail of modern life. It interprets it as a sign of risk. For hundreds of thousands of years, being alone meant being vulnerable, exposed, without protection against the environment, against predators, and against one's own group. These circuits haven't disappeared with urbanization, the internet, or the modern idea of emotional independence. They remain active, silent, operating beneath language and consciousness. When someone says they don't need many people, the brain doesn't hear that phrase as maturity. It hears it as an absence of predictable bonds. And in the face of this absence, systems linked to anxiety begin to operate in a compensatory way. The amygdala, responsible for detecting threats, becomes more sensitive. The dopaminergic system, which regulates reward expectations, begins to seek faster and less complex substitutes than real human relationships. The brain learns little by little that bonds are uncertain, require effort, involve emotional risk, and that avoiding them seems, in the short term, safer. This is where the first dangerous distortion arises. The person not only feels they have few friends, they begin to feel that maintaining emotional distance is a form of self-protection. Isolation ceases to be a state and becomes a pattern, not because the individual desires to be alone, but because their nervous system associates closeness with exhaustion, frustration, or rejection. This association doesn't arise by chance. It is built from past experiences, social microtraumas, unstable bonds, subtle rejections, and unmet expectations, often accumulated since childhood. Translated from Portuguese to English, www.onlinedoctranslator.com. Society, in turn, reinforces this mechanism with extreme efficiency. It offers ready-made narratives that transform loneliness into a sign of strength, autonomy, or emotional superiority. Better alone than in bad company ceases to be a timely warning and becomes a philosophy of life. The absence of deep bonds is repackaged as self-control. Emotional detachment is sold as emotional intelligence, and the brain, always attentive to symbolic social rewards, accepts this exchange without realizing the hidden cost it imposes over time. What is almost never discussed is that, while rational discourse claims everything is under control, the body reacts differently. The autonomic nervous system remains in a state of discrete alert. Sleep loses depth. The mind becomes more ruminative. Tolerance for frustration decreases. Small rejections take on disproportionate weight. And, silently, the ability to create new bonds begins to atrophy, not due to a lack of conscious desire, but due to neural conditioning. The lack of friends, therefore, is rarely just a lack of people. It is often the result of a brain that has learned over time that connecting hurts more than distancing oneself. And when this learning becomes consolidated, Loneliness ceases to be perceived as an external problem and begins to be experienced as part of one's identity. The uncomfortable question that begins to form here is not how many friends someone has, but what exactly has this person's brain learned to fear in human relationships? And why has this fear gone unnoticed for so long? When we observe someone who maintains few close relationships throughout their life, the tendency is to imagine that there was a conscious decision at some point along the way, as if the person had weighed the pros and cons and rationally opted for a reduced social circle. The brain, however, does not work that way. It does not make complex decisions based on abstract reflections, but on repeated emotional associations, slowly registered in circuits that operate below consciousness. The brain learns through exposure and consequence. Whenever an attempt at bonding generates discomfort, frustration, feelings of inadequacy, or rejection, even subtly, this event is not filed away as an isolated episode. It is incorporated as data. The amygdala registers the emotional context. The hippocampus associates the experience with similar patterns, and the reward system evaluates whether the energy invested produced sufficient emotional return to justify further attempts. When this return repeatedly fails, the brain does not conclude that the right people were missing. It concludes that the risk is not worth it. This is a rarely recognized point. Avoiding attachments is not a sign of emotional coldness, but of a nervous system that has become excessively efficient at anticipating pain. The person doesn't stop connecting because they don't feel the need, but because their brain has begun to automatically predict that closeness will demand more than they can offer without becoming exhausted. This calculation isn't done in words. It happens in milliseconds, as a vague feeling of social fatigue, disinterest, or a desire to withdraw, which the individual interprets as a personality trait. Over time, the brain begins to confuse self-protection with identity. The phrase, "this is who I am," comes to mask an emotional adaptation process that has never been consciously revisited. The individual believes they prefer to be alone, when in reality their nervous system has been trained to reduce relational expectations as a way to avoid frustration. Dopamine, a neurotransmitter linked to motivation and the anticipation of pleasure, begins to be released more intensely in predictable activities under individual control. Content consumption, excessive work, games, social media, because in these activities, the risk of rejection is minimal. Meanwhile, real human interactions with their emotional unpredictability begin to demand more cognitive effort. The brain needs to monitor facial expressions, tone of voice, signs of acceptance or avoidance. For a system already sensitized by previous experiences, this effort is interpreted as a potential threat. The response is not overt panic, but subtle withdrawal, frequent cancellations, conversations that don't progress, invitations that are not extended. Isolation sets in without a dramatic event, simply through the accumulation of micro-avoidances. There is an even deeper and more uncomfortable element to this process. The human brain doesn't just avoid external rejection. Above all, it avoids activating old emotional memories associated with the feeling of not being enough. Close bonds have the power to touch these old layers, where experiences of devaluation, comparison, abandonment, or emotional invisibility reside. By reducing the number of friends, the individual also reduces the chance of accessing these pains. The price paid for this anesthesia is the progressive limitation of one's own emotional life. Modern society contributes to this pattern by normalizing functional, superficial, and fragmented relationships. Professional contacts, utilitarian interactions, and quick exchanges are sufficient to maintain the appearance of an active social life, while deep bonds become increasingly rare. The brain, constantly exposed to this logic, learns that intense closeness is unnecessary, or even reckless. The illusion of connection is created without the emotional commitment that true friendship requires. The result is a silent paradox. The fewer friends a person has, the more the brain adapts to their absence, and the more it adapts, the harder it becomes to create new bonds without triggering internal discomfort. Isolation becomes biologically self-justified, not because the person is at peace with it, but because their nervous system has learned to operate in this way. The question that then emerges is disturbing. At what point did the brain stop seeking connection and begin treating detachment as a legitimate form of emotional survival? And what was lost in this process without anyone noticing? As the brain adapts to reduced attachment, an internal narrative begins to solidify, not as a conscious lie, but as a convenient interpretation of one's own experience. This narrative often revolves around the idea of emotional self-sufficiency. The person comes to believe that they don't need many friends, that they are self-sufficient, that they function better alone, and that emotional dependence is a weakness they have overcome. However, the brain did not evolve to function in isolation. Prolonged, and this belief, although socially valued, comes into direct conflict with its biological architecture. From a neurological standpoint, emotional regulation is not an exclusively internal process. The human brain learns to regulate fear, sadness, excitement, and frustration, primarily through co-regulation with other brains. Facial expressions, eye contact, voice intonation, and the emotional predictability of nearby figures directly modulate the activity of the limbic system. When these references disappear or become rare, the brain must take on a function for which it was not designed, stabilizing complex emotions without reliable external support. In the short term, this adaptation may seem efficient. The person experiences less conflict, less disappointment, less pressure. There is a feeling of control, almost of relief. The problem is that the brain does not interpret this reduction in social stimuli as neutrality, but as an impoverishment of the environment. And in the face of impoverished environments, it tends to decrease overall emotional sensitivity, not only to pain, but also to pleasure. The result is not tranquility, but a discrete form of emotional numbness that sets in without fanfare. This dulling of emotions is rarely recognized as a loss. It is often mistaken for maturity, rationality, or focus. The person notices that they are less emotional, less involved, less frustrated, and interprets this as personal growth. What they don't realize is that the same mechanism that reduces pain also reduces the capacity for connection, belonging, and emotional intimacy. The brain, in protecting itself, closes doors that it doesn't know how to easily reopen later. There is also a less discussed aspect to this process, the illusion of choice. Contemporary society reinforces the idea that we are always choosing how to live, with whom to relate, and even how much to feel. This creates a feeling of total freedom, when in reality many of these choices are adaptive responses to past experiences. The brain doesn't ask if it wants to isolate itself. It reacts to what it has learned. And then it constructs a rational narrative to justify this reaction. At this point, the lack of friends ceases to be perceived as a symptom and begins to be defended as a value. The individual not only accepts solitude, but begins to explain it, rationalize it, and even promote it. Any threat to this balance, a more intimate invitation, an attempt at emotional closeness, begins to generate internal discomfort. Not because the person doesn't desire connection, but because their nervous system associates proximity with a loss of emotional control. The brain then enters a state of silent contradiction. On the one hand, older circuits continue to signal the need for belonging, social predictability, and recognition. On the other hand, more recent circuits shaped by experiences of frustration activate withdrawal and avoidance responses. This tension does not manifest as conscious conflict, but as social fatigue, apparent disinterest, or a feeling that people are too much trouble. Over time, the cost of this adaptation begins to appear indirectly. The person becomes more sensitive to small rejections, even without exposing themselves to them. Frequency. Social anxiety doesn't explode, but it infiltrates recurring thoughts, silent ruminations, and negative anticipations. The brain, deprived of positive corrective experiences, begins to generalize old pains as if they were still current. The question that arises then is not whether someone can live with few friends, but what happens to a brain that learns to regulate itself emotionally without enough human mirrors to confirm its own emotional existence. Even when a person believes they have become emotionally independent, the brain's attachment system is not deactivated. it merely changes form. Attachment is a set of deeply ingrained circuits responsible for monitoring proximity, predictability, and emotional security. These circuits do not cease to operate because the individual has rationalized their loneliness. They remain active, seeking signs of relational stability, albeit in a distorted or misplaced way. When consistent human connections are scarce, the brain begins to transfer attachment needs to objects, routines, ideologies, or even mental states. Work becomes a refuge. Productivity becomes identity. Rigid control of one's own routine begins to offer a sense of security that was previously provided by stable relationships. This substitution is not random. The brain prefers predictable systems in which it can anticipate outcomes without the risk of rejection. The problem is that none of these substitutes respond emotionally in return. From a neurological standpoint, this creates a silent imbalance. The attachment system continues to send out searching signals, while the environment does not offer sufficient human responses to modulate it. As a result, the brain enters a state of chronic affective vigilance. This is not explicit anxiety, but a diffuse feeling of incompleteness, often masked by constant busyness or voluntary isolation. The person feels they are always holding on to something, even when they don't know exactly what. This phenomenon becomes even more evident when we observe how the brain reacts to small, unexpected approaches, a gesture of genuine interest, a deeper conversation. An attempt at emotional intimacy can provoke disproportionate reactions, intense discomfort, a desire to distance oneself, or even irritation. Not because the connection is unwanted, but because it activates attachment circuits that have been out of proper calibration for too long. The brain no longer knows how to gauge closeness. It oscillates between desire and defense. There is also a less visible but structural cost to this adaptation. The prolonged absence of deep friendships reduces the brain's exposure to healthy relational conflicts, and conflicts, when properly processed, are essential for emotional maturity. They teach boundaries, negotiation, empathy, and repair. Without them, the brain misses opportunities to develop tolerance for relational frustration. It becomes less flexible, more rigid in its expectations, and less willing to endure discomfort in the name of maintaining the bond. Society rarely recognizes this emotional impoverishment because it doesn't generate immediate collapse. On the contrary, it is often functional. People with few connections. Deep relationships are often seen as focused, independent, and efficient. The suffering that emerges from this pattern is silent, spread over time, accumulating in small emotional losses that go unnamed. The absence of friends doesn't hurt like a rupture, but corrodes like continuous wear and tear. In this context, the brain begins to operate under a constant contradiction. It needs attachment to regulate emotions, but it has learned that attachment is unstable, demanding, or dangerous. This contradiction does not resolve itself. It merely adapts, creating increasingly sophisticated ways to avoid deep contact while maintaining the illusion of emotional control. The question that remains unanswered is inevitable. What happens to an attachment system that remains active in an environment that no longer offers sufficient bonds to sustain it? And how long can the brain maintain this artificial balance without deeper consequences? As the brain sustains this artificial equilibrium for extended periods, consequences begin to emerge that are not immediately associated with a lack of friends, precisely because they do not manifest as explicit loneliness. Functional isolation does not present itself as constant sadness or a conscious desire for companionship. It infiltrates areas seemingly disconnected from emotional life, altering how the individual thinks, decides, and perceives themselves. From a neurobiological point of view, the absence of stable bonds reduces the amount of external emotional feedback available to the brain. This feedback is essential for calibrating the perception of personal value, belonging, and social relevance. Without it, the brain begins to operate in a closed loop, in which thoughts and emotions feed back into each other without sufficient external correction. This increases the tendency towards rumination, self-criticism, and negative interpretation of ambiguous events, even when the person considers themselves rational and balanced. The human brain wasn't designed to be the sole judge of its own emotional experience. When this happens, it tends to exaggerate internal threats and minimize signs of acceptance. Small failures gain excessive weight. Simple decisions become cognitively more costly. Decision paralysis arises not from a lack of ability, but from excessive internal monitoring. Without close friends who offer contrast, perspective, and spontaneous emotional validation, the brain assumes it needs to predict everything on its own, and this task exhausts it. There is also a silent alteration in the relationship with pleasure. Dopamine, which responds not only to rewards, but also to the expectation of shared experiences, begins to be released more irregularly. Activities that would previously have been naturally reinforced by the presence of others, conversations, laughter, shared memories, lose intensity. The brain tries to compensate for this with more immediate and controllable stimuli, but the satisfaction obtained is short-lived and often followed by a vague feeling of emptiness or irritability. This process directly affects how an individual perceives themselves in the social world. Without consistent emotional mirrors, emotional identity begins to become abstract. A person knows who they are in functional terms, what they do, what they produce, what they avoid, but loses clarity about who they are in relation to others. The sense of emotional continuity weakens. Life goes on, but with fewer affective milestones to organize memory and give depth to experience. Society once again reinforces this state by valuing performance, autonomy, and emotional control above connection. The functionally isolated individual is rarely questioned. They meet deadlines, maintain an appearance of stability, and do not demand emotional attention. Their suffering does not generate interruption, does not call for help, and does not mobilize those around them. Precisely for this reason, it persists. Over time, the brain begins to confuse emotional survival with a fulfilling life. The absence of intense pain is interpreted as well-being. The lack of conflict is mistaken for peace. But behind this apparent stability lies a nervous system operating with reduced resources, deprived of one of the main sources of emotional regulation that the species has developed: friendship. The question that arises then is not whether this lifestyle works, but how much does it cost over the years? And can the brain sustain this relational impoverishment without something essential being irreversibly lost? When a lack of friends extends over years, the brain no longer perceives it as a transient condition, but as the standard state of emotional functioning. At this point, there is no longer a clear sense of loss, only a normalization of the relational void. The nervous system adjusts to this scenario in the same way it adjusts to any chronic environment. It reduces expectations, conserves emotional energy, and redefines what it considers sufficient to maintain internal stability. The most unsettling aspect of this process is that it doesn't eliminate the desire for connection. It merely silences it. The desire doesn't disappear because it's embedded in deep circuits of social survival. What changes is how the brain processes it. Instead of driving closeness, the desire is reinterpreted as annoyance, distraction, or weakness. The mind learns not to listen to certain internal signals. And what isn't listened to doesn't disappear. It simply manifests itself in indirect ways. These manifestations often arise during times of transition, vulnerability, or loss. Life phase changes, illnesses, aging, or unexpected ruptures expose the fragility of an emotional system that has operated for a long time without deep connections. The brain, deprived of stable, effective networks, finds it difficult to reorganize complex emotions. The feeling is not one of sudden loneliness, but of diffuse helplessness, as if an emotional foundation that was never fully built were missing. There is also a less obvious but structural consequence of this trajectory: the increasing difficulty in recognizing and trusting signs of affection when they finally appear. The brain, accustomed to absence, treats presence as something strange, potentially unstable. Gestures of care generate distrust. Proximity generates vigilance. The attachment system, deregulated for a prolonged period, no longer clearly distinguishes between threat and acceptance. What could be restorative comes to be experienced as a risk. At this stage, society no longer offers comforting explanations. The narrative of independence loses strength in the face of accumulated emotional reality. But there is also not enough cultural language to name this type of suffering. It is not classic depression, nor evident anxiety, nor explicit social phobia. It is a relational emptiness that has been normalized to the point of becoming invisible, even to those who experience it. From a neurological point of view, what remains is a highly adapted, yet limited brain. It has learned to survive with less connection, but not to flourish in that state. It functions but with less emotional flexibility, less relational resilience, and a reduced capacity for effective integration. And this limitation does not present itself as a failure, but as silence. The neurological truth about a lack of friends isn't that some people don't need connections, but that the human brain is capable of adapting even to things that deprive it of essential parts of its own nature. This adaptation, while effective in the short term, takes a toll over time that is rarely recognized, while there is still room for conscious choice. The final question, which offers neither comfort nor an immediate answer, remains open. How many of our certainties about who we are nothing more than silent adaptations to absences that we have learned to call normal? And what would happen if the brain were finally confronted with this truth without defenses?